So you know that meme of that guy who's like he's flicking one domino and it gets
Mhm.
increasingly bigger?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think in this case you could probably say 9/11 as the small piece and isekai is the big one.
Elaborate.
So there's a long story to this. So historically, the electric power companies in Japan, they were developed partly with the influence of two different actors. Like the first one were the British and the second one were the Americans.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so like the British and the Americans implemented different standards based upon the companies they decide to work with.
Right, yeah. You get, 60 from
it's-
Britain and 50 from the US.
So like I think what happened is like I think it's called like the Hokuriku line or something, but it's like there's a very specific like demarcation, like a no man's land of sorts in Japan where literally splits the country in half. It's like this half is 60, this half is 50.
The real north-south divide.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to the Weeb Crew, a podcast about disaster anime with slides. My name is Psyotic. I'm the person talking right now. My pronouns are he and him. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host Mumi.
Hello.
And today we have on this disastrous episode of the Weeb Crew, Joe from Pause and Select.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. If anybody is interested, I have recently or soon to be publishing a chapter in the Journal of Games Criticism on Crispy's Tokyo Jungle as it relates to Donna Haraway's concept of tentacular thinking.
So everyone, look out for that. That's going to be coming to a social studies journal near you. So what are your top 5 disaster anime?
I don't watch anime.
Damn.
Oh, that's
getting
important.
canceled.
This is an anime podcast, so I guess we're just gonna we're just gonna have to rely on your general knowledge of natural disasters or just disasters in general. So
natural disasters.
If you want to give us like, so let's. I mean, as we start off, what are your top 5 natural disasters, Joe?
What
are the best natural disasters in history?
No, wait. Are we talking about like specific events, or are we talking about like general situations? Like,
let's do
earthquakes
I was
and
thinking
meteors.
I was thinking like specific events. So instead of like the Yellow River moving, a specific instance of the Yellow River moving.
Oh, okay. No, not Tunguska.
Tunguska.
That one sucked. Nothing happened.
Nothing happened there. That's a mystery.
Yeah. The wildfires that happened about 2 years ago was pretty great, you know? New Yorkers finally got a taste of what it felt like to live up north in Canada.
True. Oh, yeah. We even got like hazy like ash and smoke all the way down in DC. That was fucking ominous.
It was, for a brief moment, North America looked like a Clive Barker media piece.
Okay, so is that number 1 or number 5?
Let's go with number 5.
All right.
Natural disasters, eh?
Yeah.
The Lisbon earthquake and tsunami in like the 1600s that killed like 80,000 people, I think.
Damn.
Yeah.
Does it have to be natural disasters? Can they just be general disasters?
No,
you don't want me to
talk
describe
about
general disasters because you're going to get demonetized.
True, yeah.
Oh no.
This movie bombing at the box office. What a disaster.
What a disaster.
I don't know.
I mean, the ongoing desertification of northern China, thanks to the Gobi. That's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool. That's cool. Also, the Sahara is also spreading, so there's that as well.
Yeah.
Soon we will become a desert planet.
We've got a strange heat hole in Siberia right now that could risk the permafrost.
Oh yeah. Isn't that like a massive runaway problem?
Yeah, it's
because there's a lot of methane in the permafrost of Siberia that if it starts to melt, it's just going to cause the climate to warm even more, causing more permafrost to melt, releasing more methane.
That's right. If you believe in God, he loves baseball because that's quite the curveball.
God damn it.
What is this? What is that? Number 4? Okay, we need one more. Number 1.
Number 1. Let's go with the classic, the 2011 Tohoku tsunami.
Wow, what a surprise. What a surprise. What a great one to let us transition to talking about Japanese apocalypticism in anime.
Look, nobody can call me a difficult guest now, all right?
True, you did just name off 5 disasters unprompted.
Really push
how much
of
that I'm going to leave in is going to be up for debate.
That's true.
The funny thing is, this is going to be the first time you're on the podcast platforms.
Oh, this is true. Yeah. For anyone who's only ever listened on the podcast platforms and wondered why the episode numbers are different.
I don't think they're different. We're just missing some.
Yeah. Some are missing. One of them is Joe's, and that's not because for any content reasons in terms of censorship. It mostly was we spent a lot of time talking about his 3x3, and it didn't make any sense.
Well, the entire
put it on
most of the anime that we talked about was on the 3x3.
And if you do not see the 3x3, you're not going to understand why we are so confused by it.
Yeah, and then the other half is talking about video games and stuff. And I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna. We need to market that on the podcast. So it's a YouTube exclusive. Go find it.
We should probably talk about I don't know, anime that are airing. You haven't seen Dedede, but you have read the manga, haven't you?
I read it a while ago. I have flickering memories of it.
It's been funny watching it because I went in. Mumi and I both went in with very little knowledge of it. I think we knew it was alien invasion, something like that, but I did not expect going in for it to be oh, this is just 311 media.
Yeah.
Rather on the nose, honestly.
It's very quite on the nose. Part of the ideology or the idea of Dedede Destruction is it's a book. So it's a book by I think the name is Noritoshi. Inio Asano is the mangaka and author. Yes,
right. Yeah.
But it's a book by Noritoshi Furuhashi, I believe. And it's called the happy youth of a desperate nation. Noritoshi Furuichi. There we go. It's the happy youth of a desperate country. And long story short, it's a sociological treatise that was really, it gained a significant amount of traction after 311. It was partly a study of how specifically young people were responding to the events of 311, because one of the things that we often kind of assume, or one of the pitfalls of the analysis of Japanese responses during that particular event, is the totalization of Japan's reactions. We're in a really interesting, and so what I mean by that is that 311 and its initial responses and how we've been understanding the initial responses of 311. So I should probably give a little bit more context to what the heck 311 is.
Probably. People are like, what do you mean? Why do you keep mispronouncing 9/11?
Oh, yeah.
311
so 311.
Fucking March.
Hell yeah. So 311, so it's also called the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. It's also called the Tohoku triple disaster. In Japan, it's called the East Japan earthquake disaster, the Hikashi Nihon Daishinsai. And essentially, what happened was on March 11, 2011, there was a massive earthquake that struck off the coast of Tohoku, which is Japan's northern region, specifically Honshu's northern region. And so that led to a massive tsunami, or a massive series of tsunamis, and that displaced a significant amount of people, and up to and including it dramatically shifted a whole bunch of cities among the northeast coast. One of the also important things is obviously one of the areas it struck was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which eventually led to its meltdown. It is important to understand that what happened with Fukushima Daiichi is a completely different set of discussions entirely on its own. That's a part of what is more generally called disaster management studies. But the main takeaway with regards to why this particular disaster is important is, one, it's the costliest disaster in Japan's history. You could argue that like COVID has surpassed it, but the way to measure
harder
that is
to
much difficult. The way to measure that is very difficult. In terms of concrete costs, 311 remains the costliest disaster of a singular event in human history. It's dramatically expensive. It led to the displacement of about 800,000 people, upon which since 2020, 180,000 were still living in like prefab shelters.
I remember looking that up recently. Yeah, it's still an insane number.
Yeah, there's 18,600 people are dead. They moved entire cities up coast. As a result of what was happening with it. And so the scale is massive. But one of the important elements that also about what came out of the Tohoku disaster is the question of who is affected. Because when it happened, there was an incredible amount of international outpouring with regards to what was going on. But all of it was saying like, oh, hang in there, Japan. You can do it. We are with you, Japan, and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And that sparked a significant and a massive backlash by a lot of people in Japan, and also a little bit of an embarrassment by some people in Tokyo, because oftentimes Tokyo drives the narrative of things that occur around it. But the thing is, what happened with 311 is that it didn't hit Tokyo. It hit Tohoku, which at the time was one of the poorest areas of Japan. So there's a kind of disgusting element to it, where like if you're somebody who is a Tohokuite living in this poor part of the country, and then everybody is like calling friends or family in Tokyo, be like, "Are you guys okay?"
It's like Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans, and then you have people being like, "Hang in there, America," or like calling loved ones in New York City or like LA asking if they're okay.
It's like I heard there was a hurricane. Are you guys okay?
Motherfucker,
Yeah.
I live in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah. And so like there's that's one of the interests that I had, right? Which was like the difference the difference in what's called area studies, where it's looking at specific cultural, geographical, political, socioeconomic spaces, and how they kind of tell very different stories based upon the area you're actually focusing on. So the Tohoku reaction, which has been a little bit kind of understudied up until only kind of recently, and in terms of how that was really happening, because most of it was fetishistic, because most of it was just like, look at all these poor people, these poor kids, they're all dead, they're all gone. By the way, I'm a writer based out of Tokyo. Like it's very it's very tough. But so to go back to Dedede, it's heavily influenced by Noritoshi Furuichi's book, because Furuichi actually takes a different perspective, which is not so much like, okay, we should be focusing less. It's not so much like, okay, we should now focus on what the Tohokuites are saying about 311, but we should actually be focusing on what young people are saying about 311. Because that's actually another area of sort of totalization that gets under discussed, which is like, oh, the Japanese response to 311 is such and such. Okay, but what does that mean? Which Japanese people are we talking about? And like, do they actually think very different things based upon very important factors like, say, age? And so that's a subsect of social studies called youth studies. And it's kind of under discussed, partly because there is this assumption that the youth of Japan are just kind of like they're like a static demographic who have not yet entered society, and therefore they are not yet in need of analysis. Because like when we talk about things like precarity and issues and difficulties in Japan, so much of it focuses upon the sort of like the later stages of life. The discussion about like
people who are working.
Of like empty societies and lonely deaths and whatnot. Like you think about like all of the discussion about like lonely deaths and how much they focus on like old people. But there's like so much less material in terms of like what does like youth lonely death looks like. And so that's, in a very long and ranting roundabout way, that's some of the influence that sort of drives the dramatic arc of Dedede. It's this mentality of like, okay, what do young people think and feel, and how do they engage with disaster?
It is interesting. I guess like you think of like the concept of like pole societies and all. I forget the term, but they kind of have an element of that, but like in reverse in Dedede, where like all the adults are now like leaving Tokyo for the countryside, which is like the reverse of what is typically talked about, like limited villages and like the youth kind of leaving for the city for better opportunities.
I was thinking also specifically, well, you look at stuff like Dedede or like Shin Godzilla, and it's interesting that these are pieces of media that are responses to 311, but at the same time, the disaster is now actually centered on Tokyo rather than somewhere else, and Tokyo being like impacted fairly minimally. It's an interesting sort of shift in perspective. It almost feels like a revenge on Tokyo to an extent.
I feel like that happens a lot. Though, like you get like Tokyo magnitude 8, and it's like the hypothetical. Like, oh, what if a magnitude 8 hit Tokyo, right? Like that's a lot of I guess a lot of like this.
Yeah, what
stuff. If? What if it didn't hit every other area
before?
But yeah, that happened. Like I guess you see that quite a bit with like anime and like Japanese media in general. Is like it usually is kind of focused on Tokyo rather than Kagoshima or something like another prefecture.
Even when it's like invoking imagery of like the Kobe earthquake, for example. Well, even see that, but it's still like in the context of like Tokyo.
even like Suzume, right? Like Suzume is
Yeah.
based in Tokyo. Like it starts off fuck, I forget where it starts, but it's also essentially like disaster tourism that then ends in Tokyo.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, doesn't it? No, it ends in Tohoku. They get, they
oh
have
right,
to go all the way.
no, I forgot about that. Yeah, I was thinking
Tokyo
like,
is like the midway point.
it's like I don't know if it's quite the midway point. It seems like it's like the turning point. I guess it's where the bad stuff all hits the fan or whatever.
Yeah, it's that's so one of the things that's like kind of really notable is that there's a few reasons why so much of it emphasizes Tokyo, and one of the reasons is obviously like Tokyo is undoubtedly kind of like a modern cultural capital of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Like so much media is produced out of Tokyo. It's produced in Tokyo, or it has to go through Tokyo, or it is disseminated through Tokyo. Tokyo effectively defines what Arjun Appadurai calls the mediascape of the sort of like modern Japanese broadcast system.
That's where all the TV networks are. That's why like every anime studio is basically in one specific area, because that's where they're all next to the TV stations.
Yeah, well,
that's
working on that Shimatsu Train video, like he chose the Seibu Ikebukuro line specifically because that's where a lot of people in the industry are just familiar with. Like that's essentially the only like, oh yeah, we just chose it because of that.
Yeah, and that's so like that's one of the general reasons why that happens. The other one is also that the same reason is that Tokyo's intellectual capital. Tokyo is also an intellectual capital in that like out of like the top 10 schools in Japan, like more than half of them are based out of Tokyo. And so when we're talking about like people who are thinking and talking about these sort of situations and disasters, policymaking, all that kind of stuff, it gets cultivated in Tokyo. And so you have this two-pronged element that's feeding into each other, where people who are producing media are also consuming and analyzing media through frameworks developed within Tokyo. And then they disseminate these kinds of ideas specifically outwards from Tokyo.
I guess it also just like heightens the stakes like very easily as well. Cause like you think of like a Shin Godzilla, the logistics of like trying to evacuate people from an area are then like magnified by an exponential amount when you're talking about a city center like Tokyo as opposed to
the largest metropolitan area in the world.
Right. Like just one simple movement from like Godzilla is killing more people in Tokyo than another area that's not as densely populated.
Then if Godzilla were to show up in like Hokkaido.
Right.
One thing I should probably mention is that like Japanese apocalypticism and Japanese eschatology, just like a lot of other eschatology, is not even cohesive. So one example is, for instance, the idea of endless everydayness. That was a term that was that Miyadai Shinji argued that it came out of like the Tokyo suburbs. It was like people in the 80s who were just like bored of like Tokyo life, living in the suburbs, talking about endless everydayness and all that kind of stuff. And so like questions of endless everyday is not even something that's directly or can be directly translatable to perhaps, say, for example, the difficulties of living in like the countryside. So even like this element of Japanese apocalypticism, which seems so integral to the way in which its media formation revolves around, is not even coherently Japanese. It's not even like consistently Japanese.
Right.
It's like Japanese to like some kinds and classes of people.
Well, it's like what we talked about earlier, where it's like, these things are not specific to Japan. But they also do not apply to Japan in its totality either.
Yeah. And like you can see that also in like other pieces of media, right? Like Full Metal Alchemist famously about like the Ainu.
Yeah.
Like that is a specific experience that is not as clearly replicable on like Honshu.
It is interesting how, like, I guess there's like an outward bias where it's like, if, you know, hypothetically, if you're an American, you will generally understand the difference where it's like, you know, here in the land of Texas, you understand the difference of like, oh, Dallas is a city. Dallas is not the entirety of Texas. You have like 4 whole different regions of Texas.
Yeah.
And then like you
of fairly different cultures.
Yeah, and then like on a larger scale, you'll generally understand like, oh, Texas is different from New York, which is different from California.
Yeah,
but
which
then
is different from West Virginia.
Yeah, but that then does not always translate to you understanding like, oh, fucking North England is different from London. Like you will just think like, oh, London is England essentially. Like It's all just kind of like London, like the trolley, the double deckers, like that's all over the place, right?
No,
not necessarily. Like, no.
But I mean, Shinkai's work is interesting, and I've talked about this before on the podcast, I think, in that you know how have the 311 trilogy between Your Name, Weathering with You, and then Suzume. And there's an interesting sort of irony, I think, at work in that Your Name and Weathering with You do not directly deal with 311.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's alluded to, but it's never like it's not specifically invoking 311. Whereas that is the case with Suzume. Suzume is about 311. It very like immediately like you can tell it's about 311. Like right off the bat, you see that iconic image of like a boat perched on a building. Like right at the start of the movie. Yeah. But there's an interesting irony in that in doing so, in making the movie more overtly about 311, unlike Your Name and Weathering with You, is that I think it actually probably is more confusing to an international audience who is not familiar with 311. Have you seen Suzume, Joe?
I haven't, no.
I mean, there's a scene in the movie where a character is going through like a notebook, like a diary, and they get to the date in the diary of 311, and it's this big moment. And I remember watching it in the theater and like looking around and being like, oh no, no one knows what those numbers mean. Oh no, this is completely falling flat. Fuck. Meanwhile, I was like soy jack pointing at the movie. Like the people might be like, oh, you see it? He did it.
They did
like,
the
what
thing.
the fuck are you talking about? Shinkai stuff is interesting in that regard, and in that also now, I mean, 311 was over 13 years ago now, and I feel like now we're starting to see Japanese media that is less reflective of 311 and more so reflective of COVID, specifically with stuff like the show Mumi's making has been losing his mind researching Shumatsu Train.
Well, it's interesting. I guess what's interesting
is also about how, like, you know, similar to Dedede, is also about how young people view and kind of grapple with natural disasters.
Yeah, well, very explicitly. Well, I guess what's interesting about kind of the shift is, like, we were kind of talking about this before we started recording, where you were saying like, or I guess we were talking about like good, quote unquote, good media doesn't directly reference the thing it's, you know, talking about or whatever.
Right.
I don't know if I agree with it, but like the idea.
I don't know if I wouldn't agree with that either.
The idea of like they don't generally directly reference the event itself, like with
Right.
Kimi no Na wa and Withering with You.
Withering with You, yeah.
But they're still directly kind of referencing physical disasters, right? Like it's still kind of like a thing. They're just like, you're now grappling with it from a different angle. But like with COVID and like the whole pandemic situation, like you can't really, I mean, you could do that, but then you're just making like, I guess you can make like a zombie movie or something, like some kind of like a new pandemic movie. Whereas like Shimatsu Train is approaching it more from like the traditional kind of like disaster perspective, in a very interesting way, but it's not
a very strange way.
It's not directly saying, it's not directly approaching it in a way where you're immediately just like, oh, this is talking about like COVID or post-COVID or whatever. It's like you kind of have to put the pieces together to be like, oh, this show about fucking 7G ending the all of this line in Tokyo or whatever is actually about COVID.
That's awesome.
It's a you should definitely check it out, Joe. It's a wild show. I know you said you don't watch anime, but it's an anime you should watch.
Why you should watch?
You should watch. Should you watch Shumatsu Train? Yes.
It is good. I think it's one of those that you kind of have to have more context to like fully get into. Because like I feel like if you just watch it without like any kind of cultural context or like what it's kind of talking.
I mean, to be fair, we didn't really have that in mind going in, but as the show went on, we were increasingly trying to piece things together.
We were at least piecing it together and like had the knowledge to piece it together and be like, oh, this is what it's
sure, yeah. It wasn't lol so random to us.
Yeah, if you don't even have that where you can like piece it together like that, it's just gonna be lol so random shit. You're just like, what the fuck?
Yeah, you're like, what the hell's going on? Yeah, so is that like I guess you would be more knowledgeable probably about like cultural discourse regarding like the COVID pandemic in Japan, Joe. Is that like something that we're going to maybe see reflected more in media going forward?
I think so, because one of the things that's kind of important is that to a lot of Japanese commentators, the pandemic hasn't actually finished. What's kind of important to understand is that Japan, and for I would say for a lot of like East Asia in general, like pandemic culture is very different from like North American pandemic culture. So like a lot of like, because like one of the things that's really important to understand is that like East Asia has a significant masking culture that is influenced by a pandemic culture. Also a work culture, but like you have to understand that like SARS hit, for example, East Asia much differently than it hit a lot of like the rest of the world when the SARS outbreak happened.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it didn't really get out to a lot of the rest of the world.
Yeah, and
yeah.
So one of the important elements is that like the protocols and the way in which like pandemics are registered in places like Japan. And this is the thing, I'm saying places like Japan because it's not unique to a Japan thing. I always want to try and avoid like saying like, oh, this is like a specific Japanese thing. That's always the Japaneseness, like the Japanese.
Man, it's crazy. All these people are dying from overwork in Japan and Japan only.
Nowhere else, dude.
Nowhere else. Nope. It's a Japan problem. For some reason, Japan is unique.
You gotta understand, all right? It only exists in Japan because, like, I know the Japanese word for it. I don't think there's a word for it in Korean. What do you mean I don't know Korean? But yeah, so that's I think one of the very important things was just that like there is a significant, well, not that significant right now as far as I understand. There is a debate upon what the extent of the pandemic and to what level it has actually receded.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that like as disaster media or like I guess you could extend it to like apocalyptic media. Do you think it has a different kind of place in Japan, like like media culture, than it would in like the West? Because like, I don't know, you think of like what we kind of produce in like Hollywood, and it's like not necessarily analogous to anything specific. Like it's reflective of ideas. You will occasionally get like a like a War of the Worlds or something that's kind of
What are you talking about? We have classic Hurricane Katrina movie, American Sniper.
but I mean you'll get stuff like the War of the Worlds is
another looter defeated.
War of the Worlds is very famously kind of about like, sleeper cells or something, the fear of being attacked from like within. So it's a very famous 9/11 movie.
Very famous 9/11. Obviously reflective of like Cold War anxieties as well.
The original story, yes. Yeah.
The original story, yeah.
I mean, I think the famous 9/11 movie is Batman v Superman.
That was a disaster.
Well, like the opening is literally him. The opening is literally Bruce Wayne running through what seems very recollective of the ashes of New York City. Then Gotham, I think, or Metropolis. I don't remember.
There's that one movie with Robert Pattinson that just ends with him being in the World Trade Center on 9/11, and that's just how the movie ends. Even something like Japan Sinks 2020 is interesting in the context of like so many strange things happening both intentionally and unintentionally with that anime, where it's very much like a response to something like 311 and this sort of like shift in like the Japanese sort of like national identity, going from like this like homogenized Yamato Japanese people to something more diverse, and the fact that it's produced by Science Saru, which is like a studio that has like since its founding basically been like an international studio, and then it's on Netflix. It came out, it released worldwide on Netflix. There's an American platform. But then it's also dealing with stuff like the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, which then, due to a different disaster, just didn't happen in 2020.
Heck yeah. I love that they still kept the branding, though. That's the most important part.
That is the most important part. It was still the 2020 Tokyo Olympics.
Yeah,
Unless we printed all this stuff, we can't exactly change it now.
Heck yeah. Yeah, so Japan Sinks is actually kind of really interesting. Japan Sinks 2020 is also very interesting because it's one of those things that's talking about mediascapes. It's very actually tried and true to the like older Japan Sinks kind of text in a lot of very specific ways in terms of how it envisions who is watching and what is happening and why would those people be watching a specific kind of disaster. Because like Japan Sinks, for those unfamiliar, is by one of the great grandfathers of the modern Japanese science fiction genre, Komatsu Sakyo, and the premise is quite simple: Japan is sinking.
It's what it says on the tin.
It's precisely what it offers. But one of the things that's really important, right, is that like there are actually two parts to Komatsu Sakyo's Japan Sinks like novels. There's Japan Sinks, and then there's Japan Sinks 2.
Yes.
Which in case if you're curious, Japan Sinks 2 does not involve Japan sinking again. It actually involves the Japanese after the country has sunk. And where do they go? Who do they deal with? And it's sort of like the international politics of like, what do people want from Japan? Why would they want that? And what does it mean to be Japanese after your country is like gone? And so what happens is in Japan Sinks 2020, it's kind of interesting because one of the critical components of Japan Sinks has always been this fascination with who is actually watching our disasters happen. And when I say our, I mean Japan as in a general sense. I'm not Japanese, so I'm not involved. But one of the oh, are you laughing?
Like a nice disclaimer there, just being like, listen, all right, I'm not like them.
I'm
all
I'm
right. So I'm just a researcher.
Yeah, I'm one of those Asian oak beetles that have invaded the West Coast. I'm not supposed to be here technically. But yeah, so one of the things that's kind of intricate or tied together, sorry, not intricate, integral. One of the things that's integral to Japanese disaster, especially in the sort of starting from the 20th century, has been the way in which it is being understood and registered in relation to an international audience seeing it happen. And so that's why Komatsu Sakio, before he died, he actually wrote a series of essays about the nature of Japanese disaster. And so he's talking about the future of Japanese disaster. He actually died shortly after 3/11.
Huh.
So, but yeah, he actually died just shortly after 3/11, and his last paper was about the future of Japan in the wake of something like 3/11. And so one of the things he talks about is this inability for Japan to separate its disasters from the visions of disasters people who are not Japanese have of it. So when they see what's happening in Japan, what do they think? What should they do? And what does it mean to be Japanese in the wake of people, for lack of a better term, gawking at your misery? Because that's what's happening in a lot of these situations.
Yeah. Or well, not even necessarily. You go back to 3/11 and that, being an event that was specifically impacted Tohoku region more so than Tokyo. People gawking at not even your misery, really, someone else's misery, and then just kind of assuming it also then applies to you.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because Yuasa, in an interview about Japan Sinks 2020, he actually mentioned that he in a little bit of an embarrassing moment, he was just when he heard about what was happening in Tohoku, one of his thoughts was, "Oh my God, can you imagine if that hit Tokyo?" And so he had a little bit of a regret about that. He's just damn, that's kind of a compromised thought to have in the middle of these people are actually getting fucked, and I'm worried about it happening to me.
It's looking, it's rubbernecking at a car crash where it's whew, thank God that's not me.
That's not me. As this woman and her child are burning to death. You're just walking past. You're just
me watching Chinese factory workers on Live Leak.
It's man, I could have been born Chinese. That would suck.
Thank God I rolled. I got a good dice roll here in the U.S.
I could have been a woman in Afghanistan trying to teach math.
I guess you're into isekai. How do you feel they kind of disaster fiction and isekai potentially mirror each other or act in response to one another in a cultural sense?
Okay, in a cultural sense. So isekai largely or partly emerged out of the. So that meme of that guy who's he's flicking one domino and it gets increasingly bigger?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think in this case, you could probably say 9/11 as the small piece and isekai is the big one.
Are you saying 9/11 created isekai?
So there's a long story to this.
Elaborate.
So So one of the things that's kind of important to understand is that a lot of the political and social commentary that was happening around the time of the early 2000s was partly influenced by a sort of withdrawal society. This is actually a mentality that preceded things like Evangelion or the Ometak. You can actually see this in Wataru Tsurumi's very famous and fairly literal book, The Manual to Suicide.
I got a copy of that.
Yeah, so Wataru Tsurumi actually has an essay in the preface. So the thing about that book is that book literally is just like, here are like 50 ways you can kill yourself. And here's like the pain meter.
Here's how effective it is. Here's how here's how much it will inconvenience other people.
Yeah, it's one of those books where you think, oh, this is clearly going to be a deep, like, sociological, cultural treatise with like a clickbait title. No, it pretty directly delivers what it offers.
Yeah, it is exactly what it says on the tin. It is different ways to kill yourself. And this is going to be horribly censored on YouTube.
Yeah. But the preface, which is very important, the preface talks a little bit about the mentality as to like why somebody would want to buy this book. And Tsurumi, so the preface talks a lot about like the sort of the mentality of pining for a sort of revolutionary apocalyptic vision that just never seems to be coming. So he talks a little bit about the Ampo demonstrations. He talks about Zen Kyoto. He talks about riots and Asumi Sanso. He talks about all of these shifts that have happened in Japan, and yet it continues to just keep going, sort of like suturing itself closed. It's what Kenneth Burke calls a symbolic act, where like ideology, quote unquote, heals itself.
Yeah.
And so one of the things he mentions about that was just like, you can watch all of this stuff on TV, all of the misery, the stuff that kind of like is happening right in front of you, being broadcasted to you, all this noise about how much the world is very realistically going through all of these disasters. Like, these are not imaginary things. These are very real things. But the moment you turn that television off, you kind of stop thinking about it. The TV like mediates your relationship to these real disasters. Like, you turn the TV off and then you say, well, that sucks, but I gotta go to work.
Gotta go to work. Thank God that's not me.
Yeah, thank God that's not me.
Thank God that didn't happen in Tokyo.
Gotta go to work. And so the thing that's kind of important about this is that like it kind of starts to engender or encourage a kind of like withdrawal society where it's just like, okay, well, if I'm actually that powerless to do anything about it, then maybe I should stop contributing to all of this. Like, there's no point. And so like that's why you have like sort of like withdrawal sort of material and all that kind of stuff. The most famous example they would cite is Evangelion. But one of the things that kind of upturns that is that like after the gas attacks in 1995, even the people who are saying that, okay, maybe we should have withdrawn, they're starting to realize that even withdrawal doesn't really help, because now you're a little bit kind of implicit in this by virtue of just simple inaction. Like, you can't ignore any of this. And so this starts to swell into a kind of non-security, sorry. And that culminates in the 9/11 terror attacks, because one of the first things then Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi says on the TV says, this kind of stuff is scary. You can't predict when this is going to happen.
Which is why we need to have Mark Wahlberg on every airplane.
That's yeah. You know, if he was on that plane, things would have been very different in that cabin.
But yeah, it's like, yeah, you don't know, I guess, when it's just, I mean, I guess similar to like a natural disaster, it can just hit.
Yeah. So like that's one of the
without
interesting
warning,
things, right?
Really,
because, So with what was happening at 9/11, there was a massive security precarity situation. Like people
Mhm.
did not feel safe, and that definitely translated over into Japan. That was a really, really big sticking point. The discussion about Japan's security immediately kicked off of it. It was like in full motion when it was happening in 9/11. It wasn't like oh, it wasn't just a situation of, oh, this is happening in America. That's terrible. It's also, oh, this is happening in America. What's going to happen to us? Like that was the continual
Mhm.
sort of line of discussion that was being pushed by commentators at that time. And so
Hmm.
there's this massive precarity over what was going on. On top of that, there was a huge austerity wave that was pushing for more temporary and contract workers. So you
Right.
had this
Yeah.
sort of like double this two-pronged situation that was happening where there's this massive security crisis, and on top of that there was this massive economic crisis, and it seemed to have been aimed especially towards young people because young people don't vote.
Yeah.
They kind of just don't vote. Um, so there's this massive push. It dramatically affected young people. So they started to have this very, very sort of uncertain and uneasy kind of relation to their socioeconomic and their security position. And so this is functionally the birth of what media theorists, Ueno Tsunehiro, would call the sort of the survival type society, the game-like society upon which people struggle against each other to realize exactly where their position is in society based upon the success of their quote unquote schemes. And that's where you start to have text like Death Note,
Mhm.
Battle Royale,
Right. Yeah.
Batum. Batum is really upfront about that. Like it's literally just young people being shitty to other young people in a
Yeah.
literal fight to the death.
Um, Danganronpa is another really
Yes,
popular. Yeah.
Danganronpa. Yeah, there's a bunch of other ones that are like less known in the West. But so
Danganronpa's
like
too is
that's
because it's like a crossover between that sort of like survival type story and then also just apocalyptic stories as
yeah.
well.
Mhm. Yeah, and so like what we have here is we have this very specific kind of vision of Japan where like the new Japan is a Japan upon which other people like struggle against each other. And so there's this
Mhm.
massive like corporate metaphor that kind of exploded quite significantly in this place. And one of the things that's kind of important is there ends up being a kind of break that happens. And the break that happens is that so many people start to realize, well, hold on, I can't even prove the legitimacy of my identity because it's completely impossible. Like the idea that, like, if you understand the rules of the game, you will succeed does not work. Because even if you understand the rules of the game, there's so many other extant factors that are required for you to succeed. There's things like
Mhm.
luck and
Yeah.
generational wealth,
Yeah.
connections. There's all of these things where like you can't actually control through the quote unquote rules of the game. So even the narrative of like all you got to do is you got to be cutthroat and you got to understand the rules of the game and you will succeed. That doesn't happen that way. And so a lot of discussion, you're going to see this as using the word odo. Are you guys familiar with that? Have you come across that
No.
a lot?
No.
So odo is the definition literally just means the royal road, but essentially odo refers to this. It's a kind of it's a kind of like a phrase or a saying, not really a phrase, but it essentially refers to this idea that like there's a right way to do things. There's like a classical orthodox way to do things. So an example that everybody will probably know is that like if you're like, damn, I need to find a new job, and then your parents say, print out resume and then walk in and talk to a
Yeah.
manager, you know, like that is like the boomer like old, like that's their like the correct orthodox way to do it. Um,
Hmm.
well, one of the things that they realize, or one of the things that a lot of young Japanese people and Japanese commentators realize, is that like this just doesn't work. It doesn't work, and
Mhm.
so there is this point where they start to realize, okay, well, if this doesn't work, then like what do we do? And so it kind of is recollective of I think Kyoko no Jidai. So like in Age of Imagination, where it's just like
Mhm.
if you do not have like a solution, one thing you can do is kind of just like escape.
Yeah.
Um, so one thing you could do is just kind of escape.
Just
And it
check out.
sounds, yeah, it sounds like kind of mean because like I feel like a lot of people, especially in the West, have this sort of Calvinistic mindset of just like, like you can't, like escapism is often seen as like
Yeah.
a bad thing, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
like it's often seen as like a bad thing, but like escapism is very much a symptomatic product of very real social and material conditions that necessitated a viewer or a reader to yearn to seek that kind of escapism.
Mhm.
It tells us a little bit about the malaise of society and what exactly do they want to escape from. And that's like a
Yeah,
very important component.
Yeah, that's something that people kind of really tend to overlook with a lot of discussions of like escapist media, at least here in like the West and like English speaking communities. There's this general, not even necessarily people avoiding it, people not even necessarily even considering the question of like, well, okay, what are people escaping from?
Yeah, like what's specifically what are they escaping from, and like why are they escaping from it? So like in terms of like isekai, like that's why you see like Sword Art Online mentioned a lot as a connective thread because Sword Art Online, originally composed in 2003,
Yeah,
is kind of like at the beginning wave of this sort of like death game mentality because
Right.
it's a literal death game.
Yeah.
You die in the game, you die in real life.
the death game that then kind of
It's a literal death
becomes like
game.
an escapist sort of isekai kind of thing.
Yeah, and it becomes like a sort of like escapist kind of
Yeah.
thing. And so like Sword Art Online is a very like interesting map of the eventual like I wouldn't say like cultural, but like mass media zeitgeist trajectory that's about to happen.
Yeah, because I mean, you
Um,
look at like the Alicization arc was adapted into anime only fairly recently. But I don't think a lot of people think about the fact that like all of SAO, everything from that first arc in Aincrad all the way through the Alicization arc came out in the 2000s. And the whole web
Mhm.
novel was basically written before the first light novel volume published, before the anime started, before any of that. So you do see like a like a sort of transitionary sort of thing where it goes from this is Sabaibuke survival type story to now Kirito's in a coma in another world.
Well, it's also like really interesting because like talking about Alicization, right? Like Kawahara implemented the critique of his own analysis into Alicization because one of the central elements of like the isekai concept is like the other world has to be an actual lived other world.
Right, yeah.
And so like he sort of fuzzies that definition by saying like, okay, what if that is another lived other world, but they're lived and otherly specifically because they're like AI.
Yeah,
Are you saying
again,
And so
well
it's just
before like isekai as a genre.
well before we even have the capacity to have these kinds of debates. And it's like it's so interesting because like the time upon which Reki Kawahara composed this story is so much like ahead of the eventual time period.
It is. It's kind of wild to think
Like-
about.
Like this is like a media theory analysis in the form of like a kind of clunky set of stories.
Yeah, where it's like he's tapping into something. He's cooking. I just don't. I'm not a fan of what he's cooking, but he is cooking something.
yeah, like if George Bataille wrote this, you know, they would be like, oh, beautiful French psychoanalysis. Like,
But it's this like vulgar low art web novel.
yeah.
It isn't. We talked about this a little bit with when we did that Zom 100 video, but I guess it's kind of interesting how even the disaster stuff is very like kind of contained to a specific area, whereas like you see like a disaster movie coming out of like Hollywood, and it's always like the entire planet is now fucked up in some like the maybe the exception is like 2012, where like the end is basically they're trying to go south to like Mexico, and that's like the whole irony of it is like, oh, they're
they got to get to like the boats in like the Himalayas or
shit
something
like that. Like, but the whole world is generally the larger scale. Like the world is affected, whereas like a lot of disaster stuff in Japanese media is generally kind of like contained to Tokyo or like Japan.
Yeah, with something like Shin Godzilla, the option's always on the table. You know, hey, we could just have the U.S. nuke Godzilla.
It's the same with Dedede too. Like even with that, like
yeah,
that's more of a global scale in the sense of like the whole world is going to feel the ramifications of, you know, alien invasion, but it's directly affecting Japan. Japan is the one that has the aliens like in Tokyo or above Tokyo.
It's almost kind of like something like District 9 in that regard, where it's like aliens show up, but then they also just get put into slums in South Africa.
I mean, I didn't know District 9 ripped off Nia Under 7. Shit.
Yeah, Nia Under 7's another weird alien invasion story where it's like they show up and then
they get put into a weird class system.
Yep. Or like, I mean, you do kind of see that like something like Zom 100 is very obviously like the world ends and it's great as long as you're alive, but we won't talk about the people who died. You just don't really think about them as being people who had lives, but what's important is our main character is having a good time.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty common with like this like disaster stuff is like this basically the Molotov into the system and just like fuck it, you know, blow it all up, fuck everybody else. I'm tired of this shit kind of thing. Whereas like a lot of like
you look at something,
you know, like isekai is like Joe said, like they're just escape. Like them as an individual is kind of retreating from the system and not necessarily bothering the system itself. It's like you can have your thing. I'm going over here. I
think it's something like The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead is all about the world has ended due to this zombie apocalypse, and we need to try and rebuild society. And the ideal society to rebuild would basically just be what came before, essentially.
So one of the arguments about American disaster is the idea that it's argued by James Berman, which is that the American disaster is heavily influenced by its pastoral frontiersman ideology. The idea here is that like society has like been like wiped out. We're set at a stage of zero, and then like it is us to like reconfigure and reestablish like small pockets of community in this like new quote unquote no man's land. And so like that's why you have this like overemphasis on like small gated local communities against like the savage outsiders, the raiders and whatnot.
Right.
It's a manifest destiny kind of thing that has like been like reappropriated for a modern audience. You know, because like that's what it is. Like that's like what the beats of a lot of these like things are. It's like, oh, like zombies are like an extant dangerous threat. We have to coalesce into like these communities, these small like communities up to and including like people walking into like fucking saloons and shit. And
we need to start erecting palisades around our town.
Yeah. Yeah, and then they always say things like, the real danger in these apocalypses are not zombies, they're your fellow man. But your fellow man always takes upon like the image of like Native American band raiders.
Well, there's a part literally in
they're
The
just-
Walking Dead. There is an arc where the villains are just people who are wearing zombie skin.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
It's like, what the fuck is this goddamn show?
It's like, we've been scalping zombies to pay this war mass. It's just like, okay.
All right. What, is
but-
this like Blood Meridian type shit we're doing now?
Yeah. And so like that's a very like continual kind of thing, right? In a lot of these kinds of like in a kind of like frontier fiction, like frontier like genre, like really like threads throughout a lot of North American apocalypticism.
Yeah.
But in Japan, it's a little bit different because in Japan, so there's a journalist and professor by the name of Minoru Watanabe, and he talks about the concept of an evacuation society. Watanabe is very interesting because he developed most of his theories as a journalist on the ground during the Hanshin quake, so 1995.
Okay.
And one of the things that he comes up with this idea is of the evacuation society. And what I mean by that is that like when the Hanshin quake happened, it happened in the early morning. And it happened in the early morning when a lot of people from outside of Kobe were going into the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so like these people were not part of the city. They don't live in the city. They live in the outskirts, in the suburbs and whatnot. And so like when this happened and then the city was stuck in like weeks to months of having like no power or like good running water and all that kind of stuff, these people who were essentially like they're alien to the city upon which they're working. They don't have any ties, they don't have any connections, they don't have any like social or cultural linkages to the city as it is in this sort of situation. And so they behave very differently, Watanabe argues, than the people who were native to it. And so the idea of like a society built entirely around displacement is a very different vision of apocalypticism than we would see like in an American frontier, like sort of mastery of nature sort of society.
Right. And that's also probably why a lot of not even with something like Japan sinks, the disaster is always much more localized. Whereas like something again, like The Walking Dead, the whole world is ended.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I mean, I guess originally like it was even more like localized where it's like, oh, this city over got hit by an earthquake and here's the repercussions and they have to deal with or whatever. And then like with the introduction of like American culture, it became more more like a larger scale, involving Japan in general. And then you get, I guess, like Evangelion, which is the world.
Yeah, on the topic of like Godzilla, right? Because you can see the scale upon which like the Universal Pictures Godzilla like handles things versus like Japanese Godzillas, because like a lot of Japanese Godzillas are specifically focused upon Japan. But when we talk about like the Godzilla like monster verse, I think it's called, that's coming out of Universal Pictures, it's like, okay, Ghidorah shows up in Italy, Mothra shows up in someplace else. There's like they show up everywhere.
Right.
There's a global vision that American media has with regards to like disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting how like removed Godzilla is from Japan in the America. Even though it's like very globalized, you could just have Godzilla come from Japan, but it's like no, it's ours in this one.
I think I haven't seen it, but there was like a TV show recently, something like that, where like they're dealing with Godzilla, and I think there are like more Japanese characters in that.
Oh, the Monarch thing.
Yeah, Monarch. Yeah. I don't know. I haven't seen any of these movies except for I think King Kong versus Godzilla.
Well, the original American one, the 2014 one, does have what's his name?
Oh, dude, talk about the apocalypse, dude. King Kong versus Godzilla, the death of Japanese cinema.
That was my favorite. That was one of my favorite movies as a kid. I had it on VHS.
Oh, the original one.
Yeah, the original
from
one.
like what is that, like 1960?
1956, I think.
1956.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fucking early. I think
Yeah,
originally,
1963.
I think originally it was supposed to be like Godzilla versus Frankenstein's monster,
Oh my god.
and like they
How is that even gonna work?
well, I guess they couldn't get the rights to use Frankenstein, but that was originally what it was like billed as, and then they kept elements of that. So like if you ever watched the original 1956 Godzilla vs King Kong, he has like
1962.
1962. Okay, I knew it was like early, but if you ever watch it, like King Kong just inexplicably has lightning powers.
Oh yeah.
Like he gets struck by lightning and then is able to harness the energy of the lightning.
That's not even something Frankenstein's monster really has. They just made that up.
I guess like in the movie, they did introduce the element of like he has to be brought to life through the power of electricity, like lightning strike.
Yeah, but he does not control thunderbolts. Like he is like the incarnation of Zeus.
To be fair, neither does this one.
I mean,
but he does.
okay.
But he gets struck
I
by
mean, you
lightning.
gotta even out the playing field.
That's true. Yeah.
You gotta even out the playing field.
He didn't have
a
a mystic power.
running Kai.
How much prep time does Frankenstein's monster get?
That's a good one. I mean, Frankenstein's monster, all right, he was able to live like 30 years and then he died on a fucking ice float. You know, that dude can't do shit. No amount of prep time is going to save his ass.
He's kind of... We're putting him up against a giant lizard that can nuke you.
Yeah.
I feel like this is an unfair
dude, what
match.
is Frankenstein's monster going to do? All right, I read the original book. I know how that ends.
Yeah, do they burn him or do they throw him in the river?
No, he just like dies on an ice float. He's just like, all right, now that I have told you my story, it is time for me to go. And then he
yeah, you're thinking of the movie.
He like goes on an ice.
Yeah,
the movie he goes up into like a big windmill and they set it on fire.
Right, yeah, and they burn him down.
The movie is completely different from the book.
I see. Does he still drown
like
a little
riffs.
girl?
I think so. I don't remember that part.
I don't think
but he definitely kills somebody. He kills somebody that causes him to chase after him.
he kills Elizabeth, I think is her name. The wife, quote. I think they get married.
And then
Frankenstein.
George needs to go out and shoot him in the back of the head.
Oh yeah.
Take him out back.
Yeah.
He's like, he's just
Frankenstein.
Like,
he just wanted to pet the rabbits.
I will take care of the rabbits.
He like learns to read from a blind dude.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
Well, like Frankenstein's monster is in the original book like quite like articulate and intelligent.
Yeah.
Huh. Not Zombie Man.
And
I mean, he looks.
Yeah,
I think he's supposed to look like a zombie man, much more so than the fucking monster in the movie. But
I think my memory might be failing me, but I'm pretty sure the reason why they went with the Frankenstein that we know like now is because like Boris Karloff had an accent, so there's like he can't be foreign. Just make him dumb.
I'm now realizing that had that like universal like dark universe thing not been a horrific flop, we probably could have gotten Frankenstein versus Godzilla.
True.
Or no, those movies are those movies Universal?
Are they maybe Warner Brothers? No,
the Legendary Pictures.
Legendary.
Who owns Legendary? Are they like standalone? I don't know how American media is.
Dude, I don't know anything.
Fucking
American media, dude. It's alienating. All right, I know SVU by osmosis.
Look, I min-max into anime. All right, I don't.
Yeah, this is true. You get mad whenever we watch something that's not anime.
Why you make me watch this fucking shit? I can't database this.
I can't pump my numbers with this. Speaking of things you couldn't pump your numbers with, though, is like you look at something like Walking Dead, whole world ends. Last of Us, the world is fucked. I think the much bleaker zombie like ending, though, zombie apocalypse ending, is just like Shaun of the Dead, where it's like, yep, we just made them into, they're now just like workers. We have them push carts at the supermarket, and it's like, oh,
I feel like,
well, it's so interesting. It's so interesting because like that's like the most like on the nose like labor metaphor.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's and again you juxtapose that with something like Zom 100, where it's like, all right, these black company workers, they're basically zombies, but then the actual zombie apocalypse happens, and then they're allowed to be people, and then you have something like Shaun of the Dead, where it's like, yeah, the zombies are just workers now.
I feel like at some point we lost the plot on zombies being a metaphor for like consumerism and like slavery and all that,
race and stuff.
Yeah, and at some point I feel like zombies have transitioned into like a drug metaphor.
Well, what the fuck is going on in that? What was it? With Zack Snyder movie where like zombies have taken over Vegas and have like their own like kingdom.
Army of the Dead?
Army of the Dead?
Or Land of the Dead.
Yeah, I think it's Army of the Dead, not to be confused with Army of Darkness.
Yeah.
Well, like, because like I guess you had an element.
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that movie. I've only seen the Red Letter Media review of that movie.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, fun fact: the first Half in the Bag episode from Red Letter Media also came out on March 11th, 2011.
Whoa!
Truly one of the darkest days in history.
Oh my god!
Wow, a lot of things happened on that day.
Yeah, isn't that the crossover you never expected?
But yeah, like because
that's like a clickbait title.
Did Mike Stoklasa cause 311 and also the Star Wars sequels to flop?
Yeah, you kind of get elements of that with like the original like Dawn of the Dead, like because it is about consumerism. There is like a parallel you could draw with like the fear about like weed and all that, like just mindless consumers or whatever. And then like I guess was it 28 Days Later that kind of, I think that's the one that popularized the sort of like fast running zombie. I don't think that's the one that like invented it though.
Oh man, maybe popularized. I feel like it's earlier than that. But
yeah, I feel like it would have to be, but like I don't know.
Yeah, and then you get World War Z. You want to talk about movies that are different from the books? World War Z, where not only you have fast running zombies, you can now just have zombies that will, like ants, just start piling on top of one another to climb up walls.
Yeah.
And they can also smell it. They can tell if you have a disease or not.
I do. It is kind of funny that like AIDS is the cure for the zombie virus.
Yeah, why? Like, oh, there's a kid that has cancer. They're just going around somehow.
But yeah, it's at some point I feel like we just transitioned into like a fear of like methamphetamines and bath salts, I guess.
So why is disaster media like so popular? Like both in Japan, like the two of the most popular things are Godzilla, and then Japan Sings is also very popular, and then I would assume that disaster media is pretty popular here in the US as well, given that Roland Emmerich still keeps getting work somehow.
Seems like it's getting more popular in like here recently with like Kimi no Nawa and all that. Like that's true, becoming a more of a thing. Maybe Japan's just black-pilled.
Black-pilled. They do have a book about how to kill yourself.
There's two ways to go about it, right? Which is I think there's the regular conversational answer, which is that like disaster movies engender exciting storylines.
Mm-hmm. true.
like the pretty straightforward one. If there's people love like media with like stakes, and
It's fun
like,
to watch people run away
the-
from things.
yeah, and like disaster movies are like very, very good at like setting stakes in place, and so it's like very exciting, and it can lead to a lot of, and it's very flexible. There's a lot of very different ways in which you can depict disasters and the conditions of those disasters, right? Because like it's not like every movie has to be it's not like every movie has to be a zombie movie, because that would be a much more
or like an
difficult
alien
question to answer,
invasion.
which is like, yeah, like why do people keep making alien invasion movies? Why do people keep making zombie movies? Like those are much more difficult questions to answer. But like disaster movies are pretty, I would say, intuitive in terms of why they are the way that they are, and in terms of their popularity, which is simply that they are exciting films with a lot of very different premises that you can do a lot of very different things about. Like Independence Day, for example, is very different from, say, Annihilation.
Yes. They're about as
they're both like
different as you could get.
Yeah, but they're both like disaster films.
Right, yeah.
And so like the way in which these disaster films depict specific things gives creators and audiences a lot of flexibility in terms of not only producing, but also interpreting exactly what is at play in the disaster. Again, going back to James Berger, this is what is called the alchemical shift. The idea that like you burn society down to its bones, and then you figure out like what is the thing that we believe is worth or important to discuss. Why do we discuss them? And what does it look like to peer into the future?
Yeah,
It's
sort of like what gets preserved is like, I think can be very revealing of like what the person telling the story, making the story, thinks are like immutable facets of society.
Yeah, that's because like you think about like all these disaster films where like people are like on their own, and there's like this Hobbesian roving band of like people out to get you and all that kind of stuff, right? When we have, quite notable academic literature suggesting that that's not always the case.
Right.
When society, quote unquote, society collapses, not everybody goes out and like wantonly murders and rapes everything in sight. Like there's actually notable pockets of communal effort that actually arises, but because there is such an emphasis, an overemphasis in a lot of ways on these specific visions of post, I would say, Anthropocene, right? Post-human domination. It kind of tells us a little bit about like who we are as like people with like values about things in society.
Yeah. You see that not even just in like works of fiction, but you look at how like reporting for Hurricane Katrina, what it focused on, there was like, oh, there's all of these people looting, and it's like, yeah, what about the people who are like on rooftops trying not to drown as like helicopters are flying over and just kind of filming them?
Yeah.
Or just general general government incompetence, which is also something I feel like you don't see that often in like American disaster fiction. American disaster fiction is like the idea that like the government is just kind of really bad at handling these situations.
Yeah. There's a theoretical element to it, right? Which is that like so this is something that is pushed very heavily by Frank Kermode. Disaster scholars, well, I should probably say eschatologists. That's the technical different, like that's the technical
Sounds very
term
similar to scatology.
Scatology. Eschatology. Eschatology is simply the study of the end of the world.
Right.
And
it's a religious term originally, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a religious term. They are slightly different or they're slightly different, but appreciably different from disaster scholars, because disaster scholars don't necessarily have to study the end of the world. They simply study disasters.
Okay.
And so, like, an example, obviously, 311. 311 is this
Right.
disaster, but it's not the end of the world.
It's not the end of the world, right?
Yeah. And so, Frank Kermode, he is a little bit of an eschatologist, and he discusses the idea of TikTok. So he talks about the concept of like time as being like tick and talk, where it's like the experiences that we have is like the tick portion. We are experiencing life, but we almost always yearn for the moment in which the talk happens, the end happens. And so there's a continual desire to like want to be the one to witness the actual end of the world. That like we actually want to see what it looks like. And so there's like a drive to sort of speculate and generate cultural texts about what it might look like.
Freudian death drive.
Freudian death drive, yeah.
Well,
on a mass scale.
Well, that seems more like a general kind of like selfishness of like, this cannot continue after I'm gone. I must, when my death must be significant. Like,
yeah, there's like a kind of like egoism, right? Of that, which is like, you know, the idea that like we are witnessing the end of the world now. And
right, yeah.
And the thing is that like this is actually a really difficult theoretical like thing, because like you might think that this is a kind of intuitive thing, but like we are like, I feel like you would all agree that we are witnessing the end of like a very specific vision of the world because of climate change.
Right.
But like everybody before has felt that they are witnessing the end of the world. So how do we know that we are actually witnessing the end of the world?
Yeah, it's it's a very big part of the Vinland Saga, even, where they're just like, oh yeah, this is the end of the world. We're all fucked. We're just waiting for the end, and that's what 7 hundreds of years ago. Yeah, there's always been this idea that this is the end of the world, and it hasn't happened yet.
Dear God.
Yeah, it hasn't happened.
Can we get this shit over with already?
But yeah, it is the end of eras. I guess like you could say like people thought the Roman Empire falling was the end of the world. Yes. When the Taylor Swift's
there's also
tour
like
ended.
oh yeah. There's also a really interesting book by Lee Quinby called Anti-Apocalypse, where she problematizes the totality of apocalypticism, where she says that like apocalypse is oftentimes a vision of the end of the world. But what's more insidious about that vision is that vision is informed by the social and material conditions of the people making that vision. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things she talks about is that like among feminist groups, the Y2K was just not the apocalyptic vision that it was really purported.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why is because the vision of apocalypse, of the end of the world on the eve of Y2K, was like this heavily masculinist vision of like the financial systems are going to go down, society is going to collapse. This sort of implicit end of patriarchy in a kind of like quote unquote negative sense. But Quinby's argument is that like when you take a look at like the what like other people outside of the orthodox hegemonic framework are talking about, it wasn't seen so much as an apocalyptic scenario. It was seen a little bit differently as a sort of a state of like new subjectivity. And so apocalypse is not even universalist, but it purports itself to be universalist. It is a vision of the world that applies to everybody within its realm. But the way in which that vision is sort of presented is deeply relativist to the creators and the viewers.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like even with like media in general, like even the way that the vehicle at which like the end of the world comes about is very relative to like your kind of view, the creator's view on how what are the problems, or like how the world will end or whatever. Like like the alien shit, like it's usually like this idea of like the fear of like colonialism, in like another sense of like we almost deserve to have done to us what has been happening to many other people over the entire history of society, or the planet or whatever. Or like fucking a lot of the climate ones are
being
usually
on
like
the receiving
planet.
end of what you've been dishing out for centuries.
Exactly. Yeah, and then like a lot of the climate ones are the like 2012 and all that's very much tied to like your comeuppance for not paying attention to climate change and all that shit.
Yeah, and to sort of like ham fist this back into like anime and manga, right? To ham fist this discussion back into anime and manga. Like, you can literally see this sort of like semi-apocalyptic vision in something like, say, the production of isekai, where people are saying left and right, isekai used to be good. It used to be this great thing. It used to be like this interesting thing with messages and themes and this empowering force for like, I don't know, like women and whatnot. And it's like, that's a fair reason to have, but it's so deeply apocalyptic because you are laying your relativist claims upon what exactly you believe must be the state upon which a particular thing is to meet its end. Because I would argue that from my relativist position, isekai is more empowering to women than ever before because more women are able to enter the production cycle easier than ever. Mm-hmm. Like, there's more female consumers. There's more ways for people who are not professional authors, not in this sort of like landed, like traditionalist sort of orthodox publishing cycle, to actually be able to write the stories that they want to write. And so, like, on one hand, you might sort of lament the death of like the good, like 90s isekai, but on another end, it's like more people have the capacity to create and express themselves in very different ways than what has traditionally been vetted by these like very specific kinds of like editors and whatnot. The death of one thing is a very perspectivalist thing to have.
Well, it's like, and I see this whenever I see people complaining that like, oh, the anime industry is like in a really bad position right now. And they always talk about it in the context of like, man, there's so many shows coming out every season. Overproduction is a real problem. If we just stopped making isekai, then the problem would go away. And it's in a case like that, it's honestly very revealing. Where it's like, oh, people wouldn't really care about like working conditions in the anime industry if the anime industry was making things they liked consistently. It only becomes a problem when it's a problem visibly on the consumer end of things. Right. Things can be completely fucked on the production side of things, but as long as like, hey, they're making things that are enjoyable, then everything's fine.
Well, they're not even looking at it from like the cultural consumer perspective of even like being in Japan. Like, there's a reason why they keep making isekai stories. It's not because like everyone hates it.
Make money.
Yeah. But like, obviously here in a Western perspective, you might be like, well, I'm tired of this shit. Why do they keep making isekai? But it's like, that's specifically your perspective as a Western consumer of Japanese media.
What the fuck is this Sazai-san show? Why do they keep making it? No one's watching it. No one's talking about it.
That's actually one of the first things that I was talking to Stevie Swan, because the first question I asked Stevie Swan is like, what is anime? And Stevie thought that was a very funny question because, like, if you talk about like what is anime, people are going to have a very specific vision of anime. They're going to think of things like Fullmetal Alchemist. They're going to think of things like Neon Genesis Evangelion, Your Name, all this kind of stuff. Like a very specific kind of like transferable, exportable kind of Japanese media. Like that is like what anime is often seen as by like people who see anime as anime. But nobody's going to fucking talk about Sazai-san, the show that's been going on since like forever. That's going to like outlive most of us.
Right.
Like
A really interesting example recently is the Rick and Morty anime. That's been coming out recently, in that I've seen a lot of people be like, "This looks like ass. This doesn't even fucking look like anime. Why would they draw it like this? Why would they draw it like this?" And I'm just thinking to myself, like, this kind of looks like Shinchan. What the fuck are you talking? You're showing your hand right now. Sit down. Know your place.
They don't have the Dragon Ball Z eyes. The fuck? This is
Well,
bullshit.
yeah, it's like
It's Dragon Ball Z eyes.
it's funny because like you can I think ANN publishes like, you know, what are like the weekly like most popular anime based on like TV ratings in Japan, and consistently the top ones are always Sazai-san is always at the top, Hail the King, and then it's like Chibi Maruko-chan, Detective Conan, Doraemon, and Shinchan. Those are like your big like 5 shows. Then you also get things like Precure, your Sunday morning cartoons, Precure, One Piece, things like that.
Yeah, Sazai-san is interesting because like Sazai-san is like used very often as like a Japanese teaching tool in Japan. Like babies, like parents will just turn on Sazai-san because Sazai-san's playing on like every goddamn channel. Dude, my gym plays Sazai-san. Like,
I think it's a sick pump.
Fuck?
Dude,
That is not a show I would expect people want to get a pump to.
in between sets of working out, I watch Sazai-san. You know?
Okay, to be fair, I think most people that watch television in gyms are probably doing cardio. They're probably not lifting.
That's fair. It's still funny though.
I'm trying to break. I'm breaking 200 to Sazai-san.
I'm gonna break my personal best deadlift.
Yeah. You know, I'm gonna deadlift like you better watch out, dude, because like I'm gonna deadlift 300 and I'm gonna go owe it all to Sazai-san.
But then let's engage in a synthesis of ideas of disaster fiction, eschatology, and the end of Akihabara. Akiba has fallen, Joe. Billions must die.
Okay. Billions.
Billions.
Billions. Well, when we talk about like disaster, and end of the world, like we can see something kind of like similar in like the decline of Akiba, because like Akiba is gone, and the death of Akiba, which I will absolutely use as a clickbait title, is not the death of its subcultures, because its subcultures have moved elsewhere. They've moved away.
Yeah. Like Japanese people moving elsewhere after Japan has sunk.
Akiba sinks.
Akiba sinks. This is the plot of Tokyo. Just
Akiba sinks.
It's gone.